Given time constraints, I'm going to keep my comments and questions to myself, and we'll move now to Loren and Caroline, who will speak of the experience of 3 countries in Africa: Kenya, Uganda, and South Africa.
All right, thank you very much. We realize that we're standing between you and lunch, so we will try to be quick. We were worried that by the time we got to us, we would not have much to say, or much to add. And to some extent, what we're saying will, I think, try to consolidate to some extent some of the points that have been raised by the previous presenters. Our presentation is well, we're going to talk jointly, so there'll be a little bit of tag teaming here. But it's coming out of a recognition, which is not going to be a surprise to anyone here, but that a global sort of recognition, and this was before the Syria crisis, that most people who've been displaced are living outside of camps. Many of these living in urban areas, and a recognition that most of these, even though Europe occupies a lot of the space, then most of the people who are living in camps are outside of camps, really, are living in countries proximate to conflict. So Lebanon, for example, or Tanzania, or countries that are right next door to periods of war. And then, as we've heard in the framing, the UNHCR and others in the humanitarian space have slowly recognized that despite the fact that they don't really like this very much, or that they didn't, this is something that's going to happen. People don't want to live in camps, especially if it's going to be living in a place like Dadaab that we saw in Jennifer's presentation, where you're sort of outside of the economy, you're outside of life. They'd rather live in cities for a number of reasons. And I think that they have slowly come to recognize that this is maybe not such a bad thing. They didn't like it at first, but they're starting to realize that, yeah, well, if refugees go into this area, they can take care of themselves, they can live a fuller life. And the donors are excited because that means we don't have to pay for them anymore. So places like Dadaab and camps are very expensive. If we can integrate people into urban economies, well, they take care of themselves, right? They also, as they've tried to actually do something about this, have realized that they have a sort of context that is very difficult. Camps are by no means an easy place, and there's been a lot of research on the politics and the economies of camps, which show that they're far more complex than the kind of safe, beautiful, safe spaces that we imagine. But cities are a whole other matter. A camp is usually built, purpose-built from scratch, with a lot that can be controlled. Cities have a long history and a lot of actors and a lot of interests with which they have to engage. Right? And in this context, the humanitarians who are used to working in camps really have not had a whole lot of success. There are some success stories, some of, we've been hearing over the last couple of days, but the UNHCR has struggled, and particularly the donors have been very frustrated by what UNHCR has been able, or more importantly, not been able to do within urban spaces. So the project that we're talking about today comes at it from quite a disparate background. So each of us having about 20 years of research on various aspects of urbanization and mobility. So if you combine that, that's almost 40 years, or more than 40 years of experience on these issues. And more recently a project, so this is, sorry Erica, this is one of those presentations with the things that pop out. But I'm going to try to talk clearly also. But research that we've been doing, which was funded by the US State Department, but together with the Urban Institute in Washington, D.C., looking at 3 destination cities. So Nairobi, which of course is right next to Somalia, Ethiopia, and also Congo, and in the past Rwanda and Burundi, major destination for refugees. Parts of Nairobi now, essentially Little Mogadishu, almost completely occupied by Somalis who've come either from the camps or directly from Somalia, or have lived in Kenya for a long time. Kampala, which is even closer to some of the conflicts in the past in Rwanda, but particularly the Sudans and Democratic Republic of Congo. And then lastly, in our hometown of Johannesburg, which is rooted in South Africa, which until Syria knocked us off the top of the logs, you know, we were the #1 recipient of asylum countries in the world, but the recipient that no one heard of, because they came in, there are no camps, and there's almost no aid programs. And these are people coming from the whole continent, which is also not a surprise, being that South Africa is really the only middle-income country within sub-Saharan Africa. So the opportunities there for people are enormous. What we did in each of these places was try to use previous research to look at what refugees needed and to say, look, if you're a humanitarian working in these spaces, what is it, what problems are you trying to solve? Then look, and this is where the sort of urban studies component comes in, at who is responsible within these urban areas. Who is it that's supposed to be helping these people? Who is it that ultimately is helping or not helping these places? And then lastly, and this is where our conclusions will be, looking at what kind of partnerships could you use? What would work in these areas? Because the policies that have been working or have been used since then have not achieved much good. So I'm going to just, this is the sort of basis of our argument, which is also trying to engage with this idea of a circulation of ideas. So we have three sort of imperatives that are facing refugees, right, or refugee organizations, right? First, they're now being asked to work in these very complex, often very difficult cities of the South, but they're supposed to do that while maintaining a kind of humanitarian neutrality. This is not to say that they've ever been neutral in political terms, but rather what they've done is focused very much on legal issues, very much on refugee rights issues, and engaged only with those parts of the government that deal with humanitarian assistance. UNHCR has been very clear, we don't do development, that's UNDP's job. We do not engage with urban government because that's Habitat's job. We just deal with Home Affairs or the Immigration Department because that's the kind of politics we can do. The aid agencies or organizations themselves are then charged with providing assistance only to refugees, and because of the sort of principles of new public management, of providing assistance that can be measured and quantified in a very discrete period of time. We've got a 1-year or a 3-year funding cycle, and in this time, we want to make sure that everyone has access to toilets, for example. That's the kind of programs that we've got. This goes against the sort of argument that we're going to make, and Caroline's going to explain, that the best way of engaging with urban environments is to echo a little bit of what Erica said, not make this a political issue and be invisible, and to try to aim at improving the places where refugees live rather than trying to improve the lives of refugees specifically. So the last slide I'm going to talk to is really just where we're coming from. What are the needs? What seems to work in urban areas? And this is based on previous research that we've done, which is to challenge and ultimately challenges a lot of what the humanitarian organizations have been doing. The first, and this was based on a survey of about 3,000 people in 4 African cities. So not just South Africa, but in Congo, in Mozambique, and also in Kenya. So one of the things we found is that legal status does very little for people. Giving them formal legal rights doesn't help them very much, in part because they almost entirely work within the urban informal economy, where very few people actually ask for your documents, and where even the police who come around are not there to enforce the law, as we know. The police in these areas are there to make money or to follow someone else's sort of agenda, but not to enforce the law. We also found that documentation and education, which is something that the UN and UNHCR has put a lot of money into, doesn't seem to make very much difference. And aid, as we've heard, does almost nothing for people. People are happy to take it, but in terms of long-term protection and sustainability, doesn't seem to do very much. What does matter is very much the kind of life that they're able to live and who they are. So if they have urban experience or they have the skills to work in the cities, particularly in terms of trading, people who come from cities who've been able to trade and are free to do so are able to do well, and the kind of ability to form social networks, to become part of the city, particularly to find ways of reaching outside of the refugee community. Building contacts with the locals gets you access to jobs, gets you access to information, finds you a way of navigating the city. So treating refugees as a category in and of themselves often works against that principle, right? And lastly, the thing that really mattered most is where people live. If the neighborhood is good, refugees do better, right? And so this is very much behind our approach that you need to provide assistance to space and to the multiple forms of people who are living in those places rather than the kind of categorical sort of assistance. So Caroline's going to take over from me and talk a little bit about what we found in our case studies.
Okay. Here, I think I'm going to hone in on our findings for the case studies. And here I want to first acknowledge our research partners, David Obot from Uganda, who did the Uganda work, Jean-Pierre, who did the Johannesburg work, and I did the Nairobi field work. Now, one of the things that we learned from our findings and from the field work that we undertook is that the lesson is that we need to work smaller, smarter, and stealthier. And as I go through the cases, I'll explain a little bit more about what we do. And I think what is interesting about these 3 different cases is that although they face some of the same processes or, and challenges around refugees, they're very different, and their contexts provoked very different success initiatives that ended, that were effective for protecting refugees. So Johannesburg, we have a very strong language of rights and inclusivity, and this we know comes from a history of apartheid, and a very strong constitution that protects everybody who lives in South Africa, and that's a rallying cry. South Africa is for all who live within it, and this is a very important aspect of their society, or their newly constructed society. But this notion of rights often excludes refugees. So while they're protected by the Constitution, when they walk on the streets, it's a very different case. So they have the rights to be on the streets. They have asylum seeker permits that enable them, that the state says that they can use, and they can live in the city, but local police, landlords, banks won't provide the services that they require. So there's this disengagement between constitutionalism and the rights to live as a refugee, but the street laws are really quite different. And so talking about strengthening the Constitution in this case does not necessarily really help them if you're a humanitarian organization that wants to protect. The second is that refugee-directed programs often heighten the risk. So in a society that is increasingly unequal, and in a society that is increasingly becoming quite nationalistic, identifying refugees as specifically vulnerable populations only points to the fact that why should they receive resources when we have South Africans who are just as poor, and a UNHCR program, which was, I think, quite misguided, decided that in this area near Pretoria, which is the capital city, they would hire private security to protect refugees who were being targeted, for crime, who are being targeted by criminals. And what they did was decide to hire a protection company to protect these refugees. But of course, what that did, when the community realized that that these bodyguards came to safeguard these people, is that at night they came and beat them all up. And so it's not, so how you protect within an urban environment is very important, given the fact that you are working in a community of diverse actors and people who are also not necessarily as well off or better off than the refugees. What our colleague Jean-Pierre sort of realized is that nothing in Johannesburg's housing policy says that refugees that refugees cannot access housing programs or welfare programs from the city. But to say refugee, to use the language of refugee, immediately puts up the people's politics, and it immediately sort of alienates politicians who don't want to necessarily be seen to provide resources to refugees. So rather, if you use poor households or households that are poor, then you can include or begin to include refugees. So it's in the language, it's in how you use, and it's in what is acceptable and not in these very specific bureaucratic spaces. And access to healthcare, again, is facilitated by addressing a very small bureaucratic block. Jean-Pierre found that refugees were not getting access to hospitals, and we thought it was because of this discrimination. It's because they're refugees, they don't come from here. And he spoke to one of the people who intake sort of who intake people who come into the hospital. And they said, well, the real reason is that we don't have enough boxes on our form to fill their ID numbers. So, you know, if they just had an extra number on the box, and if you work with the, you know, the refugee, if you work with the health department, if you work with the software people, you can just add an extra box and nobody will be any the wiser. So these are the things that we're talking about. Smaller, smarter, and really this kind of stealthy approaches to protection. Kampala is also a very different context. Kampala, the city is run by the presidency. So local councils just have very little authority on anything that they do, let alone on refugees. And as such, you know, in this context, it does make sense for the UNHCR to, you know, knock on the doors of the presidency and begin to talk about what they do for migrants or for refugees. But maybe because of this kind of neglect or lack of authority, what refugees have managed to do there is just sort of integrate. They go and they're participating in informal markets. They get housing, and really have become invisible in the city. And if we start having someone say, well, what about the rights of refugees in Kampala? What's going on? We only draw attention to something that people in their everyday lives have already begun to navigate and negotiate pretty invisibly and pretty successfully in terms of their own protection. In Nairobi, again, we found a very different context. So now, unlike Johannesburg, where if you talk about rights, everybody nods very, very meaningfully and says, yes, 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 yes. You go to Nairobi and talk about rights and the Constitution, and they will laugh at you. They'll say, yes, yes, we understand that rights and the Constitution, and that's what they say. But we are not there yet, and we are not expected really to fulfill those rights. I know I'm digressing, but my husband happens to be American, and in our Constitution it says that if you're married to a foreign spouse, that foreign spouse is due citizenship. So I phoned the Minister of Home Affairs and I said, well, my husband is American, he wants citizenship, and they laughed at me. I said, why are you laughing? It's in the Constitution. They say, well, oh, don't talk about that. But this is the thing, is that so if you go talking about rights to the mayor, to the councillor, at the city government level, they'll tell you, they'll look at you with blank stares. Talk to them about business. Now then they will start to listen. What role do refugees play in the economy? How can they contribute to the revenue stream of the city? License them, and they'll pay licenses diligently, and that's a way that you can get revenue streams. So to talk about business to the mayor or the governor of Nairobi, he's going to be very welcoming of these people who are going to improve his revenue streams. What we also learned is that we need to figure out that there are multiple entry points for improving practice in the bureaucracy. So we have we have the UNHCR that always is looking at government obligations at that level, and their signatory obligations to global agreements. But what we found in Nairobi is you work with the bureaucrats hidden somewhere in the back there. And you're trying to understand what is their pain and what incentives can you provide. Refuge Point was very interesting. A small NGO that was trying to address the crisis of the health crisis amongst refugees in Nairobi. And what they had been doing, their practice was, if you come with an emergency, they pay for each individual refugee to go to a hospital. And that became, of course, quite unsustainable. One person in their team said, but wait a minute, we have a national health insurance fund. And nothing in that policy says that refugees or non-Kenyans cannot buy into that fund. And she went to the man who was responsible for expanding the number of subscriptions to the National Health Fund. And she said, well, we can work with you. We promise that we can give you 1,000 more people on your fund in 3 months if you allow us. And he said, well, I don't have the capacity. They said, don't worry. We will bring our team and we will fill in the forms. And as of today, anybody, and including refugees who are in Kenya, are eligible to subscribe to that and as such have access to healthcare. Now those are the kinds of sort of back stealthy, it's not bad practices that we think might be of use in working in urban areas. We also have a disaster management fund in the county government. And if you start talking about a refugee fund, nobody, help these refugees, no one's going to listen to you say. Tell the governor, look, you have a disaster fund and this is a disaster. He says, oh yes, that's a good idea. Yes, this is a disaster. So all we're trying to say here is working smaller, finding the language in these contexts that work to protect refugees. So what do we do? How do we convey to humanitarians and institutions like that about how to work in this environment? And I think what we're proposing is that we move beyond the do and spend more appeals. Your government is not spending enough. You don't, blah, blah, and begin to think really about recalibrating urban assistance. And I think the first point is to recognize that although the ways in which humanitarian organizations have historically worked, is great at providing a sort of a global regime of framework, but that we need to negotiate outside refugee law. Refugees are a perennial political pariah. They do not vote. They do not have a political voice. They're of no interest to anybody in cities, and as such, we do not want to necessarily expound on their vulnerabilities over the vulnerabilities of real voters. Most effective protection may rely really on invisibility, on not only on institutions that deal with humanitarian invisibility, so working the back door, not necessarily making these big claims, but also on the invisibility of refugees themselves who are in these contexts. And protection premised on aligned interests and solidarity, and this is something that urban planners know. You work with the community, you work with community leaders, CBOs, institutions at the local level, and these are the ones that you can use to expand protection for refugee communities who live amongst these people. So we're arguing for the reconciling of these imperatives that are quite tenuous. Our research says that you need to allow invisibility, you need to avoid parallel systems of rights and services, not one for refugees and another for the regular other people, to foster intergroup solidarity, which I've talked about, to engage in complex, non-linear policy processes. So you're trying to find that entry point that reduces the pain of a particular bureaucrat. That is not necessarily very straightforward, and there'll be some wins and some losers, but those are the things that really are going to make a difference. And the aid policy, then this is where the contradiction comes in, is aid policy. The political economy of humanitarian institutions is to highlight the visibility and the plight of refugees. It is to highlight the institutions' importance in challenging and making this work. And this is, we're arguing, is really not necessarily the way to go, especially in these contexts. And also, of course, and Loren mentioned it, the processes of quantifying and being categorical and distinguishing between populations in the ways in which they're evaluated, that can't work in these. So very, very lastly, I'm so sorry. Yes, 2 seconds.
We'll just put these up.
Right? You can read them. Okay. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much, Caroline and Loren, for a very insightful and interesting presentation that challenges much of what we already know about how to deal with urban refugees.